All right, let's get finished here with section 4. Here's the focus question. The South's traditional leadership, planters, merchants, and Democratic politicians condemned the new governments as corrupt and inefficient examples of black supremacy. But corruption, which existed in Reconstruction governments, was confined to no single race, region, or party. The rapid growth of state budgets allowed many to enrich themselves at public expense. But corruption was greatest elsewhere, in the whiskey ring involving Grant administration officials and New York's infamous Tweed ring, controlled by Democrats. Rising taxes needed for schools and railroad development also sparked opposition to Reconstruction, including among poor whites who had initially supported the Republicans but bolted to the Democrats when their economic situation did not improve. Southern whites opposed Reconstruction primarily because they could not accept that blacks should vote, hold political office, or enjoy legal equality. They thought Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planters to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. Violence was endemic in the Reconstruction era South. At first, it was local and unorganized, with blacks being assaulted and murdered for refusing to make way for whites on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But the establishment of Republican state governments after 1867 ignited organized campaigns of violence against supporters of radical Reconstruction. Secret societies, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, tried to prevent blacks from voting and tried to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. The KKK, a terrorist organization started in 1866 in Tennessee that soon spread throughout the South, functioned as the military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it started a reign of terror against black and white Republican leaders. But blacks were especially targeted, particularly blacks who held office or exercised political rights. The new Southern governments could not suppress the KKK, and in 1870 and 1871, Congress adopted three enforcement acts that outlawed terrorist groups, allowed the president to use the army against them, and defined acts that deprived citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. President Grant dispatched federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK, and by 1872, most areas of the South were peaceful. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s. Radicals such as Thaddeus Stevens passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the best men in the South, that region's natural leaders. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and endorsed Greeley. But many rank and file Democrats could not stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant won a second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their often openly racist attacks on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by black rule. A severe depression beginning in 1873 also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were widely successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives. But before this new Congress met, legislatures passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases in 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states, effectively mitigating the 14th Amendment. 3 years later, the court gutted the enforcement acts by throwing out the convictions of some of those responsible for the Colfax Massacre of 1873. By the mid 1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats regained control of states with large white voting majorities, such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves redeemers for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and 1876, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential elections. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried those states with which both parties claimed to have won would become president. Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission, which, with a Republican majority, decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and been elected. Pardon me for that. But to secure this result behind the scenes, Republicans negotiated with the Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promised to respect black rights and not dispute Hayes's right to office. This became known as the Bargain of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments there. Significantly, the triumphant Southern Democrats failed to live up to their pledge to recognize blacks as equal citizens. Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted and in some states held office well into the 1890s. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South, blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all citizens came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race. Reconstruction revealed some of the tensions inherent in 19th century discussions of freedom. And that is the end of our last section. We'll see you for the next one.